Hello and welcome. Now, in previous videos you would have heard me mention the dominance of Leyland in the late 1960s and the 1970s. From within the bus industry there was much frustration with this. And with the introduction of the Leyland National, Leyland had adopted a kind of take it or leave it attitude which left the bus industry rather cold. With the Leyland National also being a fully integrally built bus, and the appearance of the very similar B15 project which would morph into the Leyland Titan, things didn't look particularly great for the country's bus bodybuilders. Long established businesses that weren't under the folds of British Leyland, such as Northern Counties, Alexander and of course MCW. As I detailed in a previous video, the advent of the Leyland National had inspired Metro Camel Wayman to partner up with Scania to produce the Metro Scania single-decker. In the early 1970s, this had been replaced by the Metropolitan, a double-decker equivalent, still using Scania running units. But the Metro Scania and the Metropolitan were still really only one-trick ponies, as they were only bodied by Metro Camel Wayman. It would take the arrival of the Metrobus in 1977, again built by Metro Camel Wayman, before things started to really change. The Metrobus was wholly designed and built by MCW and was semi-integral, so it meant it could be bodied by other bodybuilders. And indeed Metrobuses were bodied by companies such as Northern Counties and Alexander, as well as MCW themselves. Although introduced in 1977, a bit like the Metrobus, the origins of the Dennis Dominator go back to the late 1960s, and it's at this point we meet this man. This was Geoffrey Hilditch. He was, and indeed still is, a much respected member of the bus industry. In the late 1960s, Geoffrey was the general manager of Halifax Joint Omnibus Committee, and was responsible for buying the last Dennis lowlines produced. Now, for those of you who may not know, the Dennis lowline was a Dennis licensed produced version of the Bristol Low-Decker, and Geoffrey Hilditch liked these buses a lot. He actually said it was one of the best engineered buses he'd ever come across. But at the same time he realised times were changing and buses were needing to change their design. However, by that point early rear engine buses were far from reliable, and there was a lot of dissatisfaction with both the Daimler Fleet Line and the Leyland Atlantean. Geoffrey knew that the new bus would have to have a Gardner engine, and a while ago I did a video about the bus industry's love affair with Gardner engines, and I'll put a little link in on the top right hand corner. And with his engineering background, Geoffrey was able to take a scrap Daimler CVG6 chassis and experiment with a Gardner engine with that. By the early 1970s, Geoffrey had moved to become general manager at Leicester City Transport. Here he had enthusiastically taken the Metro Scania and the Metropolitan. But the corrosion problems and the lack of fuel economy, such as you'd get with the Gardner engine, had shown the industry that the bus manufacturers could do better. So Geoffrey approached Dennis Brothers of Guildford, which by now was Hester Dennis, and provided them with the scrap Daimler chassis and the Gardner engine that he'd been experimenting with. But Dennis had been out of the bus industry since 1967, when the last lowlines, the ones that Geoffrey had bought, had been built. However, he convinced Dennis to start designing a rear-engined bus, and this was to be the company's first rear-engine bus chassis, and became the Dominator. It fitted somewhere between the Daimler Fleet Line, which was by now the Leyland Fleet Line, and the MCW Metrobus. Unlike the Metrobus, which was semi-integral, this featured a traditional chassis which could be bodied by other bodybuilders. It was initially designed with a drop centre rear axle, like the Daimler Fleet Line. However, later on there was the option for a hub reduction axle, like the one that was fitted to the MCW Metrobus. Also, like the Metrobus, air suspension was fitted as standard, and the radiator was fitted to the front of the chassis. Power initially was from the Gardner 6LXB engine and the Voith transmission, which again was the same as the Metrobus. Later engine options would include the Rolls-Royce Eagle and the Cummins L10, again like the Metrobus. In late 1977, the first two Dennis Dominators appeared. The first one, with chassis number DD101/101, was SHE722S. It was fitted with East Lancashire bodywork. It was to become the first of many for South Yorkshire PTE, but was initially finished in Hester Dennis demonstration livery, where it went around the country demonstrating to various bus operators. It later gained the more familiar South Yorkshire brown and cream fleet livery, but was still occasionally used by Hester Dennis for demonstration purposes. This bus later passed to an independent operator in Bedford and was sadly scrapped in the early 1990s, which is a huge shame considering the big part it played in the Dennis Dominator story. The second Dennis Dominator, and the one that is regarded as the first production Dennis Dominator, was on chassis DD101/102 and was registered UFP 233S. This also had East Lancashire bodywork and was for Leicester City Transport, the company that Geoffrey Hilditch was the general manager of. Fortunately, this bus is now in preservation and is fully restored with the Leicester Transport Heritage Trust. As I mentioned previously, the first two Dominators were ready by the end of 1977, with the excellent bus lists on the web stating that SHE722S was delivered in November 1977 and UFP 233S for Leicester being delivered in October 1977. True production of the Dennis Dominator got underway in early 1978 with the continuation of the batch for Leicester. This was followed by XBF 700S, which was bodied with low-height Alexander bodywork and was for National Bus Company's subsidiary Potteries Motor Traction, where it would be trialled. But unsurprisingly, the National Bus Company's love affair with the Bristol VR and the Leyland National held sway. However, this early Dennis Dominator and some other early ones which were for East Staffordshire were to pass to another National Bus Company subsidiary, that company being Maidstone District in Kent, which took a batch of Willowbrook-bodied Dominators in 1979. Maidstone District really did seem to like the Dennis Dominator, and it also took some former Merseyside-bodied vehicles as well. Now, the Willowbrook bodies on these were huge. They topped out at something like 14 foot 10 and looked very similar to the Willowbrook bodies on Bristol VRs, which probably caused some confusion amongst bus enthusiasts when they first came out. Merseyside was one of 3 PTEs to take the Dennis Dominator and took them with the aforementioned Willowbrook bodywork as well as Alexander bodywork. Greater Manchester Transport PTE and its successor GM buses operated a fleet with locally built Northern Counties bodywork, and when the company was split and part of it passed to Stagecoach control, many of these Dennis Dominators passed to Stagecoach and continued to operate in their liveries. But of course, when you're thinking PTE and Dennis Dominator, you automatically think of South Yorkshire Transport PTE. They became very well known for their fleet of Alexander bodied vehicles, and would eventually end up with a fleet of 318, which bizarrely included a Dennis Dominator trolley bus. But dear viewer, I will do a separate video about all the weird and wonderful Dennis Dominators and the Dominator spin-offs after this one, and I will cover that, the single-decker Dominators and all the exports in that video. Some of the South Yorkshire buses had Rolls-Royce Eagle engines, and they all featured the hub reduction axles. South Yorkshire also had buses bodied by East Lancashire and Northern Counties, and some of the last buses delivered were fitted with coach seating for their fast line services. And as a testimony to the Dennis Dominator design, South Yorkshire ones didn't come out of service until July 2006. The Dominator was also rather popular with the municipal fleets as well, and whilst it certainly never sold in blow your socks off numbers, examples found their way into most of the fleets. Companies like Brighton, Bournemouth, Southampton and Thamesdown, Cleveland, Chester and Warrington, and Kingston upon Hull City Transport, who built up quite a sizable fleet of Dennis Dominators. But the largest municipal operator was, of course, Leicester City Transport, later Leicester City Bus, who accumulated 123 buses, which were delivered between 1977 and 1989. Most of these had Alexander bodywork, although some had Marshall bodywork. In 1984, London Buses started its alternative vehicle evaluation trials to try and find if there was any suitable off-the-peg vehicles that were now available. It ordered 3 Dominators, and these were H1 to H3, H for Hester, and these were fitted with dual-door Northern Counties bodywork. All were powered by Gardner engines, with H1 having a Maxwell gearbox, while H2 and H3 had Voith gearboxes. They operated on the 170 route alongside the other vehicles on the trials, Leyland Olympians and Volvo Ailsas. In 1991 they would pass to London Coaches, and they were all withdrawn by 1993. They were later sold to Capital City Bus, who then sold out to First Bus, and for a while found themselves operating in Leicestershire alongside more native examples. But it wasn't until the late 80s and 1990s that the Dennis Dominator was to make any inroads into London and its surrounding areas, with batches being delivered to London and Country, and Ensign Bus, who ordered 24 dual-door Northern Counties buses in 1990. The Ensign operations passed on to Capital City Bus and then on to First Bus, as I mentioned previously. In Scotland, the Dennis Dominator was bought in penny numbers by A1 Services. Biggest operator of the type in Scotland, though, without a doubt, was Central Scottish Motor Traction, who operated a fleet of 51 Dominators fitted with low-height Alexander bodywork. These buses were delivered between 1978 and 1983. In addition to this, Strathclyde PTE ordered some buses, but this order was cancelled and the buses later passed to Main of Manchester. After the deregulation and privatisation of the bus services in the mid-1980s, production of the Dennis Dominator became rather sporadic, even more so in the 1990s. Just 8 buses were built in 1992, and the 3 that were built in 1993 were the cancelled order for Strathclyde that I mentioned previously that went to Main of Manchester. There were no Dennis Dominators built in 1994 or 1995, but in 1996 the last 4 Dennis Dominators were built, and these were for London and Country, and they worked at Guildford Depot. Fitted with Alexander bodywork and powered by Cummins L10 engines, they later passed to Arriva, and it seemed like Arriva didn't really know what to do with them, as they moved to far-flung locations such as Southend, Merseyside and Maidstone. The last Dennis Dominator being N716 TPK. There had been just 1,007 Dennis Dominators built, which when compared to the Leyland Atlantean or even the Bristol VR wasn't very many at all. Sadly, like the prototype, the last Dennis Dominator was also scrapped after being used for spare parts. But sister N715 TPK does survive in preservation, and was briefly in the Southern Counties Omnibus collection, until her then owner got bored of playing with buses. Fortunately, she is now in safe hands, and this important vehicle is now owned by a responsible owner. The Dominator was replaced by the Dennis Arrow, which had a fairly short production life itself before that was replaced by the Dennis Trident, which was much more successful. You don't need me to tell you how successful the Dennis Trident is. Just take a look out of a window near a bus route and you'll probably see one go past at some point in the proceedings. And there we are, we've reached the end of the story of the Dennis Dominator. Or have we? Well, no, we haven't really. There will be a part 2 to this video which will feature some of the more strange Dennis Dominators, as I've mentioned before. There were single-decker Dominators, there was the trolley bus I mentioned previously, there were many exports, and there were spin-offs as well, such as the Dennis Dragon, Dennis Falcon and the Dennis Domino. We'll also take a brief look at Dominators in preservation as well. So don't forget to hit that subscribe button and that notification bell if you don't want to miss out on that next video. If you did enjoy this video, also don't forget to give it a big thumbs up. Thank you ever so much for watching this video. I do really appreciate all your input, your comments and everything like that. So please don't forget to comment, and I shall catch up with you with the next instalment. Bye for now.